Welcome, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Good morning. This is 10 Years Hence. Our guest this morning comes to us from New York via Zoom technology, which is usually reliable, but sometimes confusing. Richard Haass is president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and this is his 20th year in that office. He previously served in the State Department under Presidents George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, at the White House under George H.W. Bush, and at the Pentagon during the Carter administration. He was United States envoy to the Cyprus negotiations and the Northern Ireland peace process, and after 9/11 was U.S. coordinator for the future of Afghanistan. Dr. Haass is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and one book on management. His most current book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, was just released by Penguin Press in January of this year. A Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Haass holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College, the Doctorate of Philosophy degree from Oxford University, along with numerous honorary degrees. He is, as well, recipient of the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award, the Presidential Citizens Medal, and the Tipperary International Peace Award. Dr. Haass was born in Brooklyn and lives in New York City. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the 2023 edition of 10 Years Hence, Richard Haass.
Both hear me and see me.
Got you there. Good morning, Richard. And so we can set this up early now. Would you prefer Dr. Haass or would you prefer Richard?
I prefer Richard. What do you prefer?
Call me Jim. Friends and family do, and so now you're part of an elite group. Good morning. I have had a look at your book, and I've been reading for the last couple of days, and I would say first, congratulations. This is a subject that has long needed a strong voice. I'm wondering if you could tell us first what prompted you to write this and what the overarching message is.
First of all, again, thank you for having me. Good to see you. Sorry we're not there in person. Look, what prompted me to write this book is not something I saw coming. I'm a foreign policy guy by training and by dint of 4 decades of work in and out of the government. But increasingly, I found myself answering the question, what keeps me up at night, not by saying China or Russia or climate change or Iran or terrorism, but rather us. Whether the United States would remain a functioning democracy. And the fact that I can no longer assume that is a rather startling development, but it's all the same true. It has real foreign policy consequences. It means we can't set an example that others would want to emulate. It means our allies aren't comfortable depending on us because we're not as predictable or reliable. It could mean our foes feel more comfortable taking risks because they see us as divided and distracted. So I think it's only one step removed from foreign policy. Indeed, in some ways, I think it's useful for people to think of this coin called national security. And one side is the stuff of foreign policy, and one side is the stuff we're talking about, all things domestic. And I think it remains to be seen whether we will be able to do it, particularly at the federal level, but also at the state level. What needs to be done to meet our challenges, our many challenges in this economy, in this society. And not only, I think the question is not only, Jim, whether we can avoid gridlock, but whether we can avoid renewed periodic political violence. And I think that's become a real concern. So essentially, it's that set of concerns that brought me again, a foreign policy guy by training and occupation to writing this book. You know, the basic premise of the book is that while rights are central to the American political experience, I mean, after all, the Constitution only got ratified on the condition that we adopt the Bill of Rights. Lincoln, when he spoke about rights, talked about our unfinished work, and in some ways, a prism through which to view two and nearly 2.5 centuries of American history is through this prism of unfinished work, of trying to narrow the gap between our rights and our realities. And my view is that's all necessary and good. But imagine for a second you had a magic wand and Lincoln's unfinished work would have become finished. Even then, we'd be in real trouble. Think about it. Rights inevitably collide. A woman or a mother's right to choose with the rights of the unborn, someone's right to bear arms pursuant to the Second Amendment, someone else's right to safety, the right not to be vaccinated or wear a mask versus the right to health. And so it's clear to me, and it became clear to me, that a rights-based approach to American democracy was incomplete. So let me give you a second coin. This is citizenship coin. On one side are rights, on the other side are obligations. The things that you and I and everybody involved in this Zoom and beyond owe to one another, and the things that all of us owe to this country and this government of ours. And only if we give obligations equal standing with rights do I believe American democracy will be able to meet its internal challenges. And only if we meet our internal challenges will we be able to meet our external challenges.
Well, I'm curious if we can put our finger on what's happened. It seems to me the rights are plainly articulated, but we can fuss about what it means to have, say, unlimited access to guns or any other particular in the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech. Clearly, it seems there are no absolute or unlimited rights. They all have guardrails of some sort. But in terms of obligations, it seems to me that when I grew up, partly on my grandfather's cattle ranch in Montana, partly in town in the Yellowstone Valley, people always seemed to think they had an obligation to one another, to the common good. And I heard that phrase a lot as a boy in the 1950s and 60s. And, there were a lot of circumstances that tested that notion, the war in Vietnam and Watergate and others. We rallied around one another after 9/11, but I don't see as many people committed to the common good, to the community, the state, to the nation, as I once did. And I'm wondering if you have some sense of why that's happened.
First off, you're spot on. That observation. I think it's true. I can't put my finger on a particular moment or a particular event, but as you say, we've come a long way from John F. Kennedy asking, ask not essentially what your country can do for you, but you can do for your country. Look, common good, you're right. It was central to growing up. We're of a similar vintage. It's based in scripture. We talk about responsibility to be the keeper for one's brother and one's sister. So it's religiously based. Why have we moved away from it? And because again, I think it's painfully apparent we have moved away from it. I think there's probably several reasons. One is Americans have probably become a little bit less church going and religious than they used to be. I know that's not something necessarily welcome at Notre Dame, but anyhow, I pointed out.
Faith and religion are separate issues, so we're clear on that.
I sit corrected, and I should know that I was initially a religion major when I went to college, so I should not need to be corrected on that point. So thank you. We don't teach this much in our schools. The idea of civics or citizenship used to be much more common to American education than it is today. I think we assumed it was somehow there. We didn't need to teach it, but assumptions tend to be dangerous things. I think the culture's become much more about me. I think that's profound in our society. It's become a more selfish, what am I owed? Enough about you, what about me, sort of culture, a little bit of narcissism, whatever other words you want to say, have become much more commonplace. I think social media has fed into it. We're all now empowered. to become our own broadcasters and publishers. And instead of having common experiences, we increasingly find these very small social media groups where we tend to hang out with the like-minded rather than with people who challenge it. We ended the draft, so we have less, and public service doesn't get the priority or the emphasis that it used to. So it might also be.
I would say I have to tell you, Bill Bradley said to me that it was, a wonderfully civilizing and a kind of shocking moment to him when he moved to the NBA from his life at Princeton. And I would say I had similar experiences when I moved to the Air Force from the bucolic campus at Notre Dame. This is a Air Force retiree pen. But if those things aren't required, if we don't have access to people where they live and where their cultural norms were developed, then do we become a nation of multiple cultures that don't talk to each other?
Well, we're well on our way to becoming that country. When you and I grew up, again, at the risk of painting us as dinosaurs, there was a big debate between whether America was a melting pot or a mixing pot. To what extent? But even the mixing pot had us as hyphenated Americans. I think now the choice is less between a sameness or a mixing pot than separate pots, where increasingly the commonness, the Americanness of our existence is in many ways being lost, which is truly dangerous to this country, because we're not a country founded on race or religion or anything else. We're a country founded on a bunch of ideas. And by the way, we're meant to celebrate the 250th anniversary of those ideas in 3 years, when the Declaration of Independence reaches that milestone. But we've moved away from it. And so what I'm thinking of is how do we reintroduce commonness? One idea is not to mandate, but would be to incentivize public service. We've done it really with the all-volunteer force, with the military. Well, why don't we take that as a model at the state and federal level and incentivize all sorts of forms of public service? For example, I didn't support President Biden's unconditional forgetting of student loans. I would have made it conditional on public service. I would make university admissions. I would give advantage to students who say did a 1 or 2 year gap and did public service, just like employers give incentives to workers who are vets. Well, why don't we do the same thing for people who've done public service? California's now introduced some really interesting pilot programs in public service. Other states are looking at it. I know the new governor of Maryland, Wes Moore, is looking at it. I think that ought to be commonplace. I think civics ought to be not just offered. I don't know what the situation is at Notre Dame, but I think civics ought to be required. I do not believe any student should be able to graduate from a 2 or 4 year institution and not have at least a grounding in American citizenship under his or her belt. We wouldn't let them graduate if they couldn't read or write or be fundamentally literate with computers, or we've put a big emphasis on STEM. Why is it any less important that our colleges and universities are preparing Americans for a lifetime of citizenship? Why are our high schools, in many cases, graduating people who, again, have had limited or no grounding in civics? They're going to have, think about it, when students leave high school and go to college, they're 18. Well, the last I checked, the Constitution now gives them the right to vote, which is great. And I hope every one of them takes advantage of that right. But I want them to understand why democracy is precious and why and how democracy is delivered for this country over the years, and why in some areas it has stopped delivering, and what could usefully be done about it, and what they can do about it as citizens. I think this has to become part and parcel of our education.
Well, two thoughts. One, that would certainly improve the elementary education system. My wife and I spent a week in Finland last August, I found it curious. I have a very good friend who lives there, and she is vice dean of the Jyväskylä School of Business and Economics, and I lectured there for a while. She is paid less than her husband, who is an 8th grade mathematics teacher.
That's
It's
interesting.
very difficult to become a teacher in Finland. You must graduate from the upper 20% of your class, and so it goes. They very much value those sorts of people and those occupations. And, as a result, they have a very clear notion of what it means to be a Finn.
That's really interesting. Can I just interrupt there about
Sure,
two
go right
things?
ahead.
I'll say two things. Well, it's a really interesting comment. Since you mentioned Finland, one of the things Finland does is they may have been the first, I could be wrong here, so I apologize, but they are certainly one of the countries in Europe that teaches information literacy in their schools. So if you go to a Finnish middle school or high school, they will teach you how to navigate this flood of information that comes with the Google machine and the internet and all of the above. And they basically teach young people how to become critical consumers of information, not what to think, but basically, again, how to know a fact when you see one, and how to know when something that's masquerading as a fact and isn't, how to recognize that. New Jersey, Phil Murphy, the governor there, has now signed into law a requirement that all New Jersey public schools teach this. I think that's a great idea. I would love to see that replicated across the country. That information literacy became a central component of citizenship. Because again, in this day and age, we're bombarded with flows. Unfortunately, a lot of those flows are filled with misinformation, and we've got to strengthen the ability of students and citizens to handle it. The other thing you say about public school teachers, I mean, in principle, we ought to pay them more. We also need to train them better. I actually think one of the real weaknesses in the American educational system, and I'll be bombarded with hate mail for saying this, is too many teachers don't get adequate preparation. They're scrambling.
Yeah.
They don't have the background to teach.
But they're underpaid, clearly. And
100%.
For many college and university students, I'll stand by this, selecting teaching as a profession is kind of a last choice. If they can't get a job on Wall Street, or if they don't get that tech job in the Valley, maybe they can become a school teacher. And I think incentivizing people, not necessarily through schools of education, but through their own discipline, history, mathematics, physics, whatever that might be.
That's key. You raise a big idea there, which is we may need to rethink the model of teacher education and less funneling towards teacher education institutions. More, we funnel people through normal education institutions, and then we top off their tank with a little bit of teacher training. But my own view is that might be a much better way to go about it.
Yeah. You also mentioned something a moment ago about rather than mandating these kinds of things, you get a better result if you get volunteers. As an Air Force squadron commander, I knew that because we were in the early 70s. We were at the tail end of the draft, and you could spot the draftees in the outfit. None of them wanted to be there. As a result, they didn't do much. I couldn't rely on them. And some of them were actually a risk. You couldn't put a draftee in the parachute shop. So you had to rely on people who were there for their own motivations. That can play out across the board. But I look at a couple of nations, South Korea and Israel, and Tom Friedman wrote an interesting article about a week ago in which he feared that Israel would no longer have its democratic roots, that it was drifting toward an autocracy like Hungary and Viktor Orban. But yet, they mandate that people serve in the military and that there is a public service requirement, but somehow it wasn't enough to sort of prevent a drift in Israeli society. Any thoughts?
Lots of thoughts. Two reactions. One is, I don't believe mandating public service in this country would be acceptable. I think we'd end up having a distracting debate about the mandate rather than about public service. Australia is a country that mandates voting. I just don't think Americans would take well to that. So my view is we want to incentivize things, or public service. We can pay people, we can train them up, we can again offer them advantages in what their next step is. I think that's the way to go. Israel is an interesting case because, yes, national service, 3 years, I think it is for men. I think it's 2 years. My numbers could be off or so for Israeli women. Usually it's done after they graduate high school, but there are enormous exemptions. Essentially, the Orthodox get exemptions and Israeli Arabs get exemptions. So increasingly, national service is less a unifying feature in Israeli society. It's yet another divisive feature. The people in the streets, for the most part, who have been protesting the proposed judicial reform, a lot of them are from either as individuals or families that have military service, but you're not seeing in the street the extremely Orthodox, and you're not seeing in the street is for the most part Israeli Arabs. So again, even in Israel, this idea, which has been in place now for 75 years, Israel just hit its 75th birthday, is not necessarily having the same results as the demographics, because of immigration and natural increase, have changed the society.
Yeah. Do you worry about Israel? I mean, it's the only real democracy in the neighborhood. And as it moves perceptibly toward the right, if these changes in the Supreme Court, so on, are put in place, do you worry about our ability to deal with them on an equal footing?
Well, I worry about it for Israel's sake. Israel, as you say, has been a lone democracy in that part of and an important part of the U.S.-Israeli relationship is based upon value. And I worry about the future of U.S.-Israeli relations if we no longer have values that are as in common. If Israel essentially becomes an illiberal democracy, I think that is dangerous for the relationship. I also think if Israel doesn't deal with the Palestinian issue, and that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
And that's the question. But then, because I worry at some point that there's a tension between Israel being a Jewish state and being a democratic state. And I always wanted Israel not to have a tension there, to be a Jewish democratic state. But the only way that can come about is if Palestinians were to have a state of their own. Turns out a two-state outcome is not only good for Palestinians, it's good for Israelis. And the danger now that the two-state solution, or outcome as it's called, is on life support, it not only means that Palestinians don't have the degree of self-government that they want and deserve, it also means that Israel is sowing the seeds of a tension or within its own society where it's going to have to choose between being Jewish and democratic. And that is a toxic choice.
Can we sort of shift to another part of the world for a moment? You've called on the Biden administration to be more robust in its verbal commitments to defend Taiwan and move away from a posture of what's been called strategic ambiguity. That seems to work for a while, but I'm wondering why you think now verbal commitments would be productive or would be helpful. And there's a follow-on to that, a kind of second part of that. Do U.S. commitments of materiel and weaponry to Ukraine hamper our credibility, or indeed our ability, when it comes to staving off an invasion or blockade from the mainland?
Okay, I'll answer both. I'll take the second one first, only because it's more recent in my Asian brain. Look, I think what's happened in Ukraine has been a remarkable demonstration of both a willingness and a capability to resist aggression. And I think tremendous respect has to go, first of all, to Ukraine, to NATO, to the Biden administration. All good. And I think it's had a constructive effect, not just in the immediate situation. Ukraine still controls 85% of its territory, but also it sent the message to the world, to would-be aggressors: don't think you can get away with it. Aggression can and will be costly. So I think that's been very salutary if one is worried, among other things, about either North Korean aggression against South Korea or a Chinese move against Taiwan. The only danger that's now creeping into the calculation is that Ukraine is absorbing so much of our equipment and munitions, is that the cupboard's getting a bit bare. And our ability to sustain conflict in multiple geographies at one and the same time is, shall we say, suspect. So I think that's an issue where there's a bit of tension, shall we say, between continuing to do all that we're doing and think about its implications for our ability to protect our interests in both in so-called Indo-Pacific as well as in the greater Middle East. But the first order response, the idea that it sends a powerful message, just as we did 30 years ago when Iraq invaded Kuwait, that when President Bush, the father, said this will not stand. I think it's important that aggressors understand that it will not be allowed to stand. In terms of our China policy more broadly, yeah, you're right. I'm the one who, with one of my colleagues here, David Sachs, advocated that we switch from ambiguity to specificity or clarity, not as a standalone, but basically to signal the mainland that even though this policy has worked for 50 years, we're worried about things they're doing, their military buildup, their increasingly ambitious public comments about Taiwan. And we want to signal them that they're not going to have a free walk there were they to move. But it's important that this tougher rhetoric on our part, two things, that it not go too far, that it not violate the so-called one China policy, that, again, we're not in favor of Taiwan's independence, but just as important that it be backed up by physical measures. We can't just have a declaratory policy. We have to have capability. So deterrence, at the end of the day, doesn't depend on what we say. It depends on what we're able to do and what we're perceived as willing to do. So we have to build up capabilities in that part of the world. Taiwan, for sure, has to dramatically transform its military posture into, it needs to spend much more, but also spend it much more wisely. Japan is getting much more involved, understanding that its security is very much linked to the future of Taiwan and so forth. So yes, there's got to be a rhetorical dimension, but even more, there's got to be various military preparations and also economic. I think that we have to think through how we would use sanctions in order to deter or respond to Chinese aggression, and how we need to make sure we in turn would not have to pay an enormous economic price because of our own collective dependence upon access to the Chinese market.
Let me return to Japan. You may know that I worked in the embassy in Tokyo for Ambassador Mansfield. There was a family connection there. He was my mother's mentor when she ran for the House, and my grandfather was a benefactor of his when Mike ran for the Senate in 48. I greatly admired him. I thought he was the last of the truly great statesmen in this country. He would say periodically, there is no relationship more important than the one between the people of Japan and the people of the United States. There are many that are equally important. Then he would say it is imperative that the Japanese chart their own course. So now here we are with a bellicose Chinese administration, problems in the Straits. Is it time for the Japanese to rearm? They swore off fissionable materials, nuclear weapons. Is it time to change that self-defense posture to be a bit more robust?
I'd say a couple of things. One is I actually think the evolution in Japan is one of the most significant things going on in the world today. What is being said in Japan, what is being written in Japan, what's being politically supported in Japan, what's being done in and by Japan would have been unimaginable as recently as 10 years ago. It's been a quiet revolution or transformation. Japan, people tend to overlook Japan, still the world's third largest economy.
Yeah.
It is one of the world's largest and most capable militaries. Plus, there's been a real transformation beginning with former Prime Minister Abe and Japanese thinking about security, much more wary of both North Korea and above all, China. Japan, what you're calling for is happening. I actually would argue that we are seeing, at the risk of sounding wonky, which I don't like to do, but forgive me, that we are beginning to see what I would call the post World War II Japan. We are beginning to see Japan becoming a more normal country. It may not involve, or may involve, I don't know, formal constitutional changes. That's got its own loaded, as you know better than anybody from your service there, symbolism. But with or without that change, Japan is now taking on an incomparably larger role in terms of security. I also think, for example, the fact that Japan and South Korea, the Republic of Korea, have recently worked out a lot of their differences stemming from the Japanese occupation during the run-up to World War II and World War II is a truly significant development. I just don't think Japan gets the attention that it deserves. Indeed, I'd say also we've had a real change in the last couple of years with both Germany and Japan. Both countries in many ways have psychologically and politically begun to move beyond what for generations after World War II defined them. And I just don't think it's getting the notice that it ought to. And I also think it's to me, it's extraordinarily welcome. I think these are really positive changes. And they've done it, as you would say, coming back to what you pointed out, they've done it their own way. They've charted their own pace. They're doing it their way. And as a result, what's happening, I think, is more likely to last.
Well, when I was there, I saw that the quality of living had improved dramatically. Housing, the diet, all of that. On my arrival there, I was introduced to a fellow in the Japanese Self-Defense Air Force who was 6 feet 2 inches tall, very muscular fellow. And I thought, this is not the Japanese my parents knew. So I would agree with you. I do think that it's time that we paid greater attention to what they think and the role that they will play in that part of the world. And let me just leave that part of the world and move on to currency and world trade in a moment. Let me ask about the Pacific. We've lost some assets in the Philippines, and I think we're moving to rebuild some of that. Excuse me. I've seen articles saying that we're stocking up on Guam, and we're thinking about how we would make a strategy work in that part of the world if we had a full-scale conflict. Any advice for policy thinkers about the Pacific?
Well, we're moving in that direction, as you say. There's AUKUS, there's the Quad. We've got new security arrangements, bilaterally and multilaterally. I think that's really healthy. I think there's got to be a military dimension to it. Also, doesn't mean we ignore diplomacy. I often remind people that diplomacy is a tool of national security.
Yeah.
I took issue, for example, with the decision of the Secretary of State not to go to China during the balloon incident. I thought he ought to have. I think that was a perfect time to go. When you have differences, that's when diplomats should get on their bicycle. Where I think we're really missing out in the Indo-Pacific is in the economic area. The fact that the United States helped design and then never joined what we used to call the Trans-Pacific Partnership for those of you who are soccer fans, is a true own goal. It's just a terrible, terrible economic and strategic mistake. It would have been a very good way to advance our economic interests, our climate interests, and our strategic interests. Just again, a colossal mistake, and it's a mistake that spanned multiple administrations. It's all those who think bipartisanship is the answer. This ought to be proof that bipartisanship need not be the answer, because this is a bipartisan mistake across several administrations now. But I do think, all things being equal, I'll end on a more positive note there. I do think the building up of a lot of these relationships is good. I think the hallmark of the Biden administration's foreign policy, now that I've just criticized it, but I think the positive hallmark is a reinvigoration of partnerships and alliances. We've seen it in Europe in the face of Russian aggression. And I think we're seeing it in the Indo-Pacific in the face of the challenge, quote unquote, posed by China.
Good. Well, let's move on. I think currency and world trade are high on people's lists of things to think about at the moment. In recent years, the U.S. has ratcheted up the use of sanctions as the primary means of exercising what you've called sharp power. The dollar's status as the world reserve currency, coupled with swift payment systems, has made this a pretty effective tool. But lately, there have been headlines in different major countries, Brazil, China, Russia, India, France, even, calling for bilateral trading currencies other than the dollar. So first, does this make any sense? Second, does it threaten the dollar's status as the global reserve currency?
Well, first, I would challenge the statement that sanctions are an effective tool. I think they're the most overused, abused tool of American foreign policy. My experience in government, there's a challenge, and the choices are do nothing, go to war, or that third, behind curtain three is always sanctions. So we reach for them all the time, and they almost always fail to achieve their stated objectives. So I'm really questioning, and look at some of the biggest. I haven't noticed sanctions may, to some extent, have affected Russia, but last I checked, it hasn't affected the course of the war. Iran is closer to nuclear weapons than they were before all the sanctions. The Cuban regime is still ensconced. So I actually think sanctions are an abused or certainly overused tool that we rely on way too much, and often we hide behind. We often don't think about the secondary effects, which aren't always good. So a healthy reconsideration of sanctions as a national security instrument would, to me, be is overdue. Let me just put it gently, and then some. And now I've gone on so long, I forget the actual. Oh, about the dollar, right?
Yeah, the dollar as a reserve currency.
Yeah, got it. Look, the dollar being a reserve currency confers a great advantage on the United States. Among other things, we can run up enormous deficits and don't have to worry in the relative. We don't have to pay our debts back in other currencies, so it's great. Other countries don't have this, shall we say, what a former French president called it exorbitant privilege. I think that was Giscard. I think sanctions have made the rest of the world increasingly looking around for alternatives to the dollar. They're not available. There's no other currency of sufficient size and that people have sufficient confidence in. But there has been a slight move away from the degree of dollar dominance. If you look at the euro, the yen, barter agreements, some things with the Chinese currency. China's currency, though, still isn't convertible, so that holds it back. I do think, though, we're going to have. We'll see what happens with the American debt refinancing and whether we're willing to do that. And I think if we're not, if Congress and the administration can't come to an agreement, and the United States reneges on its debt, I think that will accelerate moves away from a dollar-dominated world. So I think to some extent, it's happening very slowly, and it's one of those advantages that we will probably not notice until it's gone. And the good news is it need not be gone anytime soon. Though I think we are going to a world that's slightly more multilateral in the currency domain. But I think the only thing that would really accelerate it would probably be a massive default by the United States, and that's on us.
Yeah.
But I do think the constant use of sanctions has, how would I put it? It's accelerated the search for alternatives to the dollar. The search so far, though, hasn't come up with a obvious alternative because there isn't one.
Interesting. You've seen a lot, obviously, as have I, but from different perches. I've seen brinksmanship before, but this one feels a little different. I'm a little more concerned that inexperienced people in the House and Senate, and I never thought I would use that phrase, might just try the waters to see if they could frighten the opposition. What do you think?
Look, I wish I could sit here and say you're definitely wrong, but I can't. This generation, like I was a Republican for over 40 years. I am no longer. This generation of Republicans, I don't recognize. They are not conservatives. I think there is a bit of a chicken game going on between the House Republicans, who want to essentially revisit all sorts of legislative outcomes, and the White House, which says it won't revisit anything. Could and should there be some middle ground between the two? I would think that is not inconceivable to imagine.
Yeah.
Whether we're going to get, it's quite possible. If you remember during the 2007-8 financial crisis, one of the major votes, I can't remember if it was on TARP, the so-called bailout, or one of the big pieces of legislation, it failed the first time. Markets swooned, markets went down 1,000 or 2,000 points or what have you. And then basically Congress took a second swing at the pitch and got it right. That could happen this time. You could have a situation where there's an impasse, essentially neither car backs off in the game of chicken. There's a bit of a collision. Markets go down considerably, and then there's people hopefully get sobered up. So I think that's, again, I'm not confident in my predictions, but I hear your concern.
Yeah.
And the idea that people will do the right thing and avoid such an outcome, I don't feel I don't feel nearly as confident as I'd like to be. Let me put it that way.
Let's talk for a moment about the global South. That's a new phrase describing powers in Latin America and, south of the equator. Europe and North America have been kind of unified in their support of Ukraine, for example. I see a new tendency, particularly in Brazil under Lula and in India under Narendra Modi, to take a more neutral approach, a kind of non-aligned movement. I don't think I've seen that since World War II. Do you regard that as good, bad, or indifferent? And what do you think the outcome of those forms of thinking might be?
Well, the short answer, I am seeing it. You had the formal non-aligned movement during the Cold War. This is a little bit related, but something different. People want to, what I think you're seeing is they don't want to sign up against Russia and China for a couple of reasons. One is they may be dependent on Russia, say for like India, for munitions and arms. A lot of them are dependent on China, economically, infrastructure, you name it. A lot of them are not particularly well inclined towards us because they get tired of our lecturing about democracy, and a lot of the global South is not democratic. So I think it's a mistake for us to frame so much of our foreign policy and rhetoric in terms of democracy. I also think we really missed an opportunity to do well with the quote unquote global South during the pandemic. The availability and distribution of mRNA vaccines was not nearly what it could and should have been. If you contrast how much goodwill we garnered during the HIV crisis, HIV/AIDS crisis, when we had the PEPFAR program that George W. Bush introduced, probably saved 20, 25 million or more lives. And the way we didn't, I believe, respond adequately to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we lost a chance there to build goodwill. We're not as active as we should be with development aid. We no longer have a trade policy in many parts of the world. So it doesn't surprise me that countries are increasingly hedging or don't want to make choices. And I guess it's going to persist. I don't much like it, particularly when such basic issues as aggression and the use of force to change borders is at stake. I would love them all, just out of self-interest, to line up with us. But I think it also, Jim, reflects the fact that China is a different kind of adversary than the Soviet Union was, that China is economically everywhere. So countries are less willing to have such a clear relationship against it. I think what we're seeing is a world of a lot more gray. And my guess is that will, like it or not, from our perspective, that's going to persist.
We've moved around the world and talked about a number of different areas and regimes, concerns. Let's move back to the U.S. This autumn at Notre Dame, we will once again select a topic and conduct a forum in which we prompt discussion and some thinking around key issues. Democracy is the theme for this fall. Now, for this lecture series in the spring, I have in mind to link democracy to a particular question. Does business have an obligation? Mm-hmm. And I want to know your thinking on this, because I'm concerned, first of all, of very large and complex organizations that move their headquarters to the Caymans or somewhere else, some postage stamp nation that collects no taxes. And while the shareholders benefit, the nation that protects them does not. So that's just one issue. Does business have an obligation of any sort to promote and defend democracy?
Well, first, let me say I'm thrilled that your Notre Dame is making such a institutional statement to do this. And the idea that you would do something in the fall, for example, with new students or whatever on democracy, I think is great. I might even be inclined to come join you. We can talk.
You are most welcome.
But I think it's really, I mean, the kinds of issues I'm writing about, other people are talking and writing about, but this idea of, look, anyone who did a minute of honest introspection would agree that American democracy is going off the rails. This is not a policy statement. This is simply the truth. And the idea about why that's so unfortunate, why this experiment of ours is so worth keeping, and what it would take to get it back on the rails, I think is a fantastic subject for conversation there and on other campuses. In the case of business, sure, look, let's just start with self-interest. If you're a business, that means you're selling a product or a service. You got people who are producing it. You got people who are buying it. That takes place somewhere. And you need law and order. You need a predictable environment so workers are safe to come to work. Consumers are safe to go shop. You need a predictable tax system, regulatory system. You need a functioning, working democracy. Indeed, that's been one of the great comparative advantages of the United States in attracting so much investment over history, as we could offer business a secure, predictable space. You got enough at risk, enough uncertainty when you start or run a business without having the fundamentals come into question. So if we suddenly had a society that couldn't meet its basic challenges, much worse, or looked like Northern Ireland, the place I was the U.S. envoy, suddenly we had political violence, that would be terrible, to say the least, whatever adjective you want to use for American business. So I think American business has a massive self-interest in the vibrancy of American democracy, more broadly, and stability elsewhere. You mentioned, the kinds of offshoring some do. Well, I would just say, why not make it easy for their employees to vote? Why isn't every business giving employees the few hours they need to vote? Or another question: why are businesses contributing to candidates that are tearing down American democracy? This is not a policy issue. Why not just have as a minimum threshold that the candidate cannot be an election denier or someone who favors the use of political violence? Why are businesses advertising on media outlets or what have you for places that give voice to those who are anti-American democracy? Why don't businesses give leave of absence? Notre Dame does.
Yeah.
If a professor wants to take, say, a 2-year leave to go work in government, you'll make it possible. And then his or her teaching job will be there when they get back. Why don't businesses do that? Make it possible to go work in city or state or federal government for 2 years with the confidence that your job will be there. So there's lots of things business could and should be doing. certainly to support American democracy, or at a minimum, not tear it down.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Ireland. I lived and worked in Ireland many, many years ago. I taught in Dublin, and I was of two minds when I saw tech firms from Silicon Valley moving, particularly to Dublin and to the west of Ireland, around Galway. And the scheme was simple. They paid no taxes. And they put their headquarters there. And, Microsoft held a shareholders meeting in a small office in the west of Ireland. That cut down on the number of gadflies at the annual meeting. But Nellie Cruz, a Dutch woman who was the competitiveness commissioner of the EU, stepped in and said, no, you can't do this, because part of taxes you collect come to the EU in the Republic of Ireland, and we want them. And Taoiseach stepped up and said, oh, no, we don't need the money. No, it's just we're looking for jobs. It was hilarious. I didn't know which way to turn. And it's now they are collecting taxes. They're being reasonable about it. But Ireland is no longer the global tax haven that the Dahlarian once thought it would be.
Well, Janet Yellen, as you know, Treasury Secretary, one of her big projects has been to get a global kind of minimum corporate tax rate. I think that's a healthy thing, so companies can't go tax haven shopping. I also think,
how far along are we on that?
It was proposed. I don't know where it stands. It hasn't been adopted yet. I don't know how close or far we are. Well, let me just make a larger point. Corporations are coming under greater political pressure in areas like climate, sustainability, diversity, and those are what they are. Why they're not, and also corporations under the Supreme Court ruling are seen as citizens. They have voice now in American politics. Yep. So to choose my favorite theme, why aren't they expected to fulfill obligations?
Oh.
And if they benefit from this country, why are they not paying their fair share? I would love to see citizen pressure on that, or worker pressure on that. You see all sorts of stories of how employees are pressing their companies to do this or not do that on some weapon system, or people are pressing this or that on sustainability or diversity. I'm not going to argue the wisdom of those positions. What I am saying is I'm disappointed at the lack of pressure on corporate leaders to be responsible citizens of this democracy. And I would love to see much greater pressure on them there.
Yeah, corporate advocacy is a huge issue now. And there isn't a CEO who isn't worried about coming down on the wrong side of it or picking the wrong issues. So that one is not going away. We've got just a few minutes left. Let me ask you a question that I sometimes think about in the absence of information. Start with foreign policy. What's the one foreign policy issue, the most important issue that gets the least attention in media coverage?
Well, as you would expect, I would say the quality of American democracy, political stability in the United States. I don't think it's focused on either as a domestic issue or as a foreign policy issue. I think we're still way too sanguine about the state and future of American democracy. If you wanted a more traditional answer to your question, in the world today, I'd say a couple of things come to mind. The country that is whose instability may have the greatest near-term consequences might be Pakistan. This is a country of over 200 million people with a significant arsenal of nuclear weapons that is in the process of failing. That's an issue. I still think we underestimate the effects of climate change, and we're seeing the growing effects potentially on migration, which could lead to not just human misery or conflict, but I think that we're not serious about it yet. If you look at all these UN meetings, they're been pretty marginal in their effects. I'd say one other area for your students. You got a lot of new technologies, AI, new generations of computers, biotech, what have you, ChatGPT. What are going to be the implications of these for foreign policy and international relations? And that's a really rich area. I mean, any student, anyone who has an area who has a background in technology and foreign policy. That's going to be a really special combination. People who understand new technologies and their international or national security implications. So I would hope that a new generation would be able to straddle those two worlds.
Yeah, we stood up a Department of Homeland Security in response to a specific event. One of my students suggested to me the other day that there should be a Secretary of Technology, someone who draws together all of the expertise, keeps an eye on the risks, the dangers, the threats to young people, privacy, all of those issues in a cabinet level agency.
Yeah, maybe. Look, the argument, I understand the argument for it. The argument against it is you don't want to localize it. You want it actually to be integrated everywhere, because there's so many technologies that have so many have multiple implications. And often it might be best. So you want people, say, who are focused upon certain technologies and their implications, either as a threat or a benefit in the health space, to be in one, and so forth. So I'm not sure co-locating technology as if it were a single phenomena in one department is the right or best answer.
Good. Well, we are down within 2 minutes. I would say to our participants, viewers, listeners, the Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens by Richard Haass, is a good read. I'm about a third of the way through it, and I am delighted with what I find. And I will leave you with that earlier invitation. If, in fact, you would like to join us at some point on the Notre Dame campus this autumn, you would be most welcome. You would be most welcome, of course, at any time, but we'd like to find a way to provide you with a spotlight and a stage. Richard Haass, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your expertise and your willingness to be with us.
Oh, thanks for having me today. And thanks, Professor O'Rourke, for all that you do, sir.
Good. To our guests and visitors, thank you for enjoying 10 Years Hence this year. It's been a wonderful session. I do appreciate it. For the students who still owe me a paper, I'm looking in my email in basket. The curtain's going to come down on this sometime soon. If you need an extension, let me know. No automatic extensions. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the day and enjoy the last few days of the academic year. Farewell.